Hello, my name is Gad Lebanon, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to this edition of Off the Shelf, a book discussion series brought to you by the Conference Board. Today I'll be sitting down with Carl Benedict Frey, who is the Oxford Martin City Fellow and co-director of the Oxford Martin Programme on Technology and Employment at the Oxford Martin School in the University of Oxford. And we are going to talk about Carl's book, a relatively new book from 2019, The Technology Trap, Capital, Labor, and the Power in the Age of Automation. So I've known Carl for quite a while, and I've known of him even before that. What made Carl famous is the paper, The Future of Employment, How Susceptible Are Jobs to Computerization, that Carl published in 2013 with his colleague from Oxford, Michael Osborne. And there they predicted that 47% of the US workforce faced a significant risk of being replaced by machines in the coming decade. And in that paper, they kind of used sophisticated statistical methods to estimate or forecast which occupations are more susceptible to computerization and automation. It was one of the most cited economic papers of the past decade, and we in fact use it a lot in our own work when we are looking for measures of susceptibility to automation by specific types of jobs. So why did we want to talk to Carl today? Well, first, his book, The Technology Trap, was selected as one of the Financial Times best books of the year in 2019. In that book, Carl describes the history of automation with a strong focus on the Industrial Revolution period. And one of the main ideas is that labor replacing technologies, when we view them in the long run, we focus on the advances that they created for humanity, but we somewhat overlook the devastating consequences of for a lot of the working people at that time. And we are now with unemployment rates in double digits. We are maybe in one of those times where because of technology and the ability to replace a lot of workers with technology, will remain at high unemployment rates for quite a while due to unemployment, due to technology. And that makes this book very relevant to our specific period. So, Carl, first of all, thank you and welcome to our podcast.
Good to be with you, Gad.
So, you probably can do a much better job than I can in describing what the book is mostly about and what are the main takeaways from it. So, can you give us a quick elevator pitch? It can be a long elevator pitch, but yeah, what do you think are the main takeaways from it?
Well, I'm not sure. I think you did a pretty good job of introducing yourself. Let's see if I have anything to add. So I think, as you probably noted, Gad, the debate surrounding automation has turned into this dichotomy where either you believe that half of jobs are going to disappear and we are looking at a dystopian future where most people can't find jobs to support themselves and their families. And we somehow, somewhat inadvertently, contributed to that narrative in the 2013 paper, The Future of Employment, as you mentioned, though we don't say that in the paper. And the other narrative is that, the future of automation is just going to mirror the past. And, the past 2 centuries of automation has just contributed to growing wealth and prosperity, and as a result of the first industrial revolution and the technological change that has come after that, people in the industrial West are 20 to 30 times better off today in terms of incomes per capita. So if the future of automation mirrors the past, we should be very happy about that. And the book tries to sort of somewhat push back against both of these narratives. So it argues that if you look at the history of automation, first of all, we need to distinguish between the short run and the long run. So technological change comes with what the great economist Joseph Schumpeter called creative destruction, which he actually took from Werner Sombart. But anyhow, it gets at this notion that it entails the new destroying the old, and some people will lose their jobs in this process. Those people might struggle to find work for some time. There's no reassurance that they will shift into better jobs. So, technological change, in short, is welfare improving, but not necessarily what economists call Pareto improving. It doesn't necessarily make everybody better off in the short run. So if technology then doesn't make everybody better off, and people don't know that they are going to end up coming out ahead, then they have some incentives to actually resist technological change. And this is something we saw particularly during the first industrial revolution. People rioted against the mechanized factory, and it's actually something that was the historical norm before the first industrial revolution. And what I argue in the book is that there is not one past of technological change. We've seen different episodes. The first industrial revolution sort of broadly mirrors this current age of automation, at least in economic terms, because we have seen a similar hollowing out of middle-income jobs. We've seen a similar fall in the labor income, and we see the sort of economic polarization also translate into growing political polarization, and even to some extent unrest, although um, not as violently as during the first industrial revolution. So, looking to history, we should not feel too confident or comfortable about the future if the future of automation mirrors the past. We should feel, quite confident that over the long run, things look pretty good, but we need to try to manage the short-term disruptive effects of technology, especially because there's no assurance that people will, embrace creative destructions and embrace automation if they don't feel confident that they will eventually come out ahead, and if we don't have certain safety nets to take care of people that struggle to adjust.
Thank you, Carl. That was excellent. Carl, you talk a lot in the book about labor enabling technologies versus labor replacing technologies. Can you elaborate a little on this, perhaps with a few examples, and why is this distinction so important?
Sure. So this is a distinction that economists and economic historians have made for a long time. And it simply refers to the fact that technology can improve productivity in a happy way that also contributes to rising wages in terms of making people more productive in their existing functions, or by creating new tasks and jobs for labor that increase the demand for labor. Or it can increase productivity in a not so happy way by replacing people in existing tasks and thereby putting downward pressure on wages and employment. And I think the most clear cut example of this is probably, if you think about something like the telescope, it didn't, destroy any existing jobs. It didn't reduce the demand for labor. It just allowed us to do previously inconceivable things like glazing at the moons of Jupiter. Conversely, if you think about an automatic elevator, what automatic elevators did is that they essentially got rid of the operators, right? So even though there are more elevators, many more elevators in the world today than there were in, let's say, 1950, there are still fewer elevator operators. And the same can be said to some extent about robots. So in certain industries where robots have replaced machine operators, despite the fact that we are, increasing the production of automobile to meet growing demand for them, machine operators are in less demand because of advanced robotics. So those technologies reduces the demand for labor in those functions, and as we've been seeing in the United States in particular for the past 3 decades now, the wages of prime-age men without a high school degree who would have taken jobs in factories before automation began and before offshoring began, I should say as well, which is also part of the story, their wages have been falling for 3 consecutive decades now. They've rebounded somewhat over the past 3 years or so before this crisis, but overall, there's been a sort of secular downward trend in wages for prime-age men with no more than a high school degree who would have taken on factory jobs.
Thanks, Carl. So, Carl, you published the book in 2019 in a period of historically low unemployment rates in most advanced economies, especially in the US, but also UK, Germany, Japan. Now unemployment rates are historically high, especially in the US. Do you feel that there will be growing interest in the topic of the impact of technology on unemployment rates as a result of the current crisis?
Well, I think what the current crisis have done, for the most part, is sort of exacerbating current trends. So automation was a big issue before the crisis, and I think it's arguably become a even bigger issue since then. In part, maybe as we will come back to later, because I think it's likely to accelerate automation. But also, if we look historically, automation anxiety has been particularly common during economic downturns. And we saw this, during the first industrial revolution. Machinery riots were particularly common during the Napoleonic War, during the Continental Blockade, when Napoleon blocked all ports in continental Europe and disrupted trade to Britain. We saw this during the Great Depression, which prompted Roosevelt to actually introduce several restrictions on the introduction of machinery in the National Recovery Act. We saw this during 3 post-Korean War recessions, that automation anxiety came back on the agenda again. And we've also seen this in the aftermath of the Great Recession. So yes, I think there is certainly a case to be made that automation is going to be a topic of even more concern as a consequence of COVID-19 than it was before.
Thanks, Carl. We're going to take a short break for some quick announcements, and we'll be back in just a minute to continue this fascinating conversation with Carl.
Can you, your team, or your company benefit from insights such as the ones provided in this podcast? They are immediately available when you join the Conference Board, a membership-based think tank that delivers trusted insights for what's ahead. Reaching across industries and geographies, we bring together our noted experts, senior executives from the world's largest companies, and nonpartisan practical research to help you address your most important business issues. Our membership packages are tailored to your organization's unique needs and budget. To learn more about our offerings, go to www.conferenceboard.org and click Join on the top bar to connect with one of our product specialists.
Welcome back to our conversation with Carl Benedict Frey. So, Carl, let's talk a little more about the impact of this current the COVID-19 crisis on automation. What do you think it would look like?
Well, it's obviously hard to predict the future, but I think one tendency that we've seen in the past is that recessions tend to accelerate automation. So what we see during the Great Recession of 2008, for example, is that routine rule-based jobs that can easily be specified in computer code and therefore readily automated disappear very rapidly during this particular period of time, and then really never come back. And I think part of the reason is because businesses want to cut costs during downturns. And part of the reason, other studies have shown as well, is that consumers or cash strapped consumers tend to opt for cheaper goods and services. So when people go to McDonald's, for example, rather than to a restaurant, they are increasing the level of automation in the economy because they are opting for goods that have been produced using more automation technology. In addition to that, I think that what makes this crisis special is obviously that it's been induced by a pandemic. And what robots can help us with as well is to physically distance, which is very much needed right now. We see companies like FedEx experimenting with robots now that can climb stairs for delivery purposes. We see hospitals introducing more robots to deliver food and medicine. And the technology can clearly help us in that regard to make sure that we are, not spreading the virus. Finally, I think what is likely to happen as a result of this is more reshoring from China, or at least some more nearshoring. And so, as you know, Gad, US-China relations have deteriorated as a consequence of this. They were pretty bad before, but I think that there is now clearly a widespread sense that we need to move back a lot of the production. And what that means is shifting production from relatively low cost destinations in East Asia closer to domestic markets where wages are higher. And if you look at the company like Nissan, right, when they produce cars in Japan, they rely heavily on robots. When they do the same thing in India, they rely heavily on cheap labor. So moving, production back to high wage countries will accelerate automation in the global economy. So I would suspect that we're going to see a significant uptake of automation technology as a consequence of this.
Yeah. Carl, in the last decade, it seems like the impact of automation was more visible in eliminating routine office jobs and some sales jobs than it was in eliminating more manufacturing related or blue collar jobs beyond the millions of manufacturing jobs that were eliminated, let's say, prior to 2011. Do you think, I know it's hard to predict the future, but do you think that we will continue to see this trend of a bigger impact on routine office jobs and sales jobs than on blue collar jobs?
Yeah, I think that's right. So manufacturing has been automation for a long time. We're increasingly seeing it in services as well. And I think looking forward with advances in machine learning, automation is not just going to be confined to these routine rule-based activities that can easily be specified in computer code. So with machine learning, computers are getting better at inferring the rules of different tasks themselves. And that contributes to this expansion of the potential scope of automation that we discuss in the Future of Employment paper. And a lot of those jobs are actually white collar jobs, but there are also jobs in transportation, logistics, construction. So virtually every industry is going to be affected by this.
Okay. Good. Carl, one of the interesting points in your book is that how easy it is for technological progress to have an impact depends on where the power is. And in many cases, the people who suffered from technological progress didn't have much political power to stop the progress. We may now have an example of um, a group that may significantly suffer from technological progress or automation, but that group is quite a lot in the center of the elites and have a lot of power. And I'm talking about university professors. So there is a lot of talk about online education, and when it comes to higher education and the potential for universities to significantly reduce the number of workers by using online education. How do you think this will shape up?
Well, what you're suggesting, Gad, is that I'm part of the problem. Doesn't stop. But to be
No,
completely honest with you, I work at the University of Oxford. We've probably, seen more change here in the last 800 hours than in the 800 years before then. And in very short time, we've shifted entirely to digital teaching. Now, whether that is going to be sustained or not, I suspect will to a large extent depend also on the demand for online teaching, which I suspect is going to be pretty high, but also the demands of our current students and alumni who tends to also, especially in the US, be an important funding source for universities. And if you paid a lot of money for a degree that is opened up next year and available to everybody, that means that the value of the degree you had obtained the previous year and paid a lot for is no longer there. So I think it's also not often in the interest of alumni who play a big role in funding universities to actually open up. But I think we are going to have to adjust to the competition. If more students opt for online versions, we will have to provide them and try to fill that market. But at the same time, I think many of the students that enroll, they're not just looking for the educational experience, they're looking more for the full college experience, which also, is a way for them to establish their networks. And it's also to some extent sort of preparation for their future life and careers. So I think that the shift may be less dramatic than some predict because of that. But I do think that going forward, universities are certainly going to face more competition, and certain parts of the university and certain courses are probably likely to open up. But as you say, Gad, when people have a stake in the existing system, and that is not just true for universities, they are not most often not too keen on change, and university professors are no exception.
Thanks, Carl. You recently wrote an interesting article in Foreign Affairs titled China Won't Win the Race for AI Dominance, where you kind of push back a little against the growing, I don't know if you should call it growing fear that in the US and other advanced economies that China is becoming a powerhouse in AI and other advanced technologies. But you're less, you think it's less likely to happen. Why?
Well, so for two main reasons. So one narrative that you will often hear is that because China has this very well developed surveillance state, and tend to have more of a disregard for privacy, they have an advantage when it comes to collecting data, which in turn is the oil for artificial intelligence, and what drives development in the field. And we are sort of trying to push back a bit against this narrative because data is not the full story. And in fact, we're arguing in the piece that if data is the new oil, then it might well be kind of resource curse, because what you see increasingly over the past 5 years with the deep learning revolution is that we tend to focus on very data thirsty applications of AI, and those tend also to be applications that are not necessarily the most valuable, but often the easiest. So AI is very good at classifying cats and dogs and that sort of thing, where there is abundant data. It's also very good at playing video games because the rules, or it's relatively easy to specify what the algorithm should achieve. It should win the game. In other domains, it's much harder. And what we are arguing in the piece as well is that AI is not yet a mature technology, right? And it is still waiting to become one. And it's quite similar, actually, to the stage in which the steam engine that Thomas Newcomen invented was extremely inefficient. It required huge amounts of coal. Steam engines were merely used to drain coal mines during this period of time, didn't have very many applications because of that. And the reason that we tend to associate the steam engine with James Watt is that he was the first person to actually make it energy efficient by inventing the separate condenser. And artificial intelligence is still waiting for its separate condenser movement to make it a more data efficient technology. We don't know yet exactly what the right path is to achieve that. There are many different tribes within the field of artificial intelligence that have very different ideas. And when a technology or when an engineering problem can't be very well defined, it's hard to sort of, you can't just throw resources at it to sort of grind it down and solve it. Most innovation tends to happen through localized experimentation, and it's far from clear that China has a particular advantage there. In fact, its social credit system and its surveillance state sort of aims at making people more obedient. But innovation requires the opposite mindset, right? Innovation is about breaking the rules, not abiding by them. So I think that actually China is likely to have more of a disadvantage in AI than is commonly perceived. In addition to that, it's clearly run by a regime that aims for political stability. And that there's always a tension between dynamism, creative destruction, and stability. If you're behind the technological frontier, you can sort of catch up through centralized planning by building roads and factories, and you can manage the transition in a sort of skillful way that helps people adjust. But when you're innovating into the unknown, it's very hard. And I think China's decision, for example, to censor the internet speaks to its preference for stability in favor of innovation. And that is the second reason why I think that China has a comparative disadvantage going forward.
So moving from the area with disadvantage, let's move for a second to the area with a lot of advantage, it seems. So the US, which seems to dominate the tech world and perhaps even gaining dominance. For example, the 5 largest tech companies in the world are all American, and many of the other big ones are also Americans. Do you think this is a coincidence, or is there something about the environment, the tech environment in the US that makes it easier to innovate in the US? And especially in comparison to Europe, which barely has any large tech companies. What's behind this difference, in your opinion?
Well, it's a very good question and a very hard question. I'm not sure if there's a monocausal story here. I think there are many factors that are required to explain this. But as you say, I don't think it's a coincidence. One widely held belief is that it has to do with America's relatively lax antitrust rules relative to Europe. I don't think that is actually the explanation. I can't think of a single company in Europe that had the potential of becoming the next Google and Facebook or Microsoft that was broken up because of European antitrust. So I don't think that can explain it. And I think it's probably more likely has to do with America having the advantage of the English language and having the advantage of a huge internal mass market. And that advantage is becoming more and more important as you move into services. So, for example, in Europe, if I develop certain services in Sweden, some of the contents are going to be completely meaningless in French or in Spanish or in Italian and so on. So culture and language plays a lot more into it when you're talking about services relative to manufacturing goods. Second, I think America has an advantage in having better funded universities. It has more movement between universities and the tech world. It has a more better developed venture capital industry. And I think these are sort of factors that are to America's advantage. So I think it's more about many of its preconditions than, let's say, antitrust rules.
That's a great answer. Thank you, Carl. We are about to conclude, but before we finish, I wanted to, a lot of people who write also like to read. So maybe you can tell us about maybe what you're reading now and what books or book inspired you in the past.
So one book I'm currently reading is Japan is Number One by Ezra Fogel, written in 1979, predicting that Japan at the time would overtake the United States. And obviously that didn't happen. I suspect there are some parallels there to be drawn with China and the US today. A book that really inspired me was Joel McCure's The Lever of Riches. It was the book that actually made me want to become an economic historian. It was the book that showed me, or made it abundantly clear to me, that wealth and prosperity comes from technology and technological progress over the long run, but that it's not a steady process. There are many factors that can hinder the adoption of new technologies, and it's a bumpy road for workers, and often when new technologies are being adopted.
Great. Well, Carl, thank you so much for joining us today. We talked to Carl Benedict Frey about his, among other things, about his book, The Technology Trap, Capital, Labor, and Power in the Age of Automation. This book is available in all major booksellers. And if you enjoyed this episode, please remember to subscribe to our off-the-shelf book discussion podcast series, or explore the entire catalog of podcast programming from the Conference Board by visiting our website. Thank you very much, Carl. It was great to have you.
Thanks for having me, Gerd. It was a pleasure.